All right, welcome to DecisionWise monthly webinar. We're glad that you've been able to join us. I am Matt Wright. I'm the president of DecisionWise. You've probably seen me on a few of these webinars in the past. And today I am with Dave Long, who is our Chief Operating Officer. Dave, you just want to give a introduction or say hi?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm excited to be here to talk about 360s and how we use them. I'm a Chief Operating Officer now, but have been a consultant with DecisionWise for a long time. Still do consulting with some of our customers even today, but started about 10 years ago in this space, and really excited to share some of the things I've learned.
Well, thanks, Dave. So the chat, we'll be using the chat a few times today as asking some questions to the audience. We also have some offers that we've thrown into the chat. And this webinar does qualify for SHRM credit, and more information will be sent out later on that for those of you wanting to maintain your continuing ed credits. Today's topic, we're going to jump in. Today's topic is on use cases for 360s. I think 360s are still considered an important tool in corporate development and in organization development. They're an excellent way to help people get feedback about the experience they create for others, what it's like to work with and around and for them. But what we wanted to touch on today is some of the trends in 360s, and also some of the, maybe a few of the different use cases and ways we think about 360s. So that's kind of what we're going to cover today. Jumping into our agenda. So again, it's sort of what are some of the best ways to use 360 and what are some of the underutilized methods? How do we look at best practices and think about them? Where are the limitations? And then a couple of things called a little segment called More for Less, which is just one tip where it doesn't cost you anything to implement, but we think it might help how you think about 360s in your organization. And then we're going to ask everyone to kind of share their key takeaway and do some crowdsourcing of learning from this process. All right, let's jump in. And our first audience question is, and we'd love to spend some time on this, and so what is the most important skill or competency for a successful leader? Reason we ask that is our 360s are based on competencies, sometimes skills. And so we would love to know what you all think is the most important of the various competencies and skills that get measured with 360-degree feedback.
For anybody just shouting it out on their screen right now, write it in the chat. And we'll be able to share it.
Yeah. So we had someone mentioned the ability to coach. That's absolutely true.
I like that a lot.
Coach others. Ability to listen.
Yep, I like that. Empathy, caring just came through.
Yep.
Kristen hits on emotional intelligence. I like that one. Another one for listening, interpersonal communication. It's good. Jess says self-awareness. We've got Randy saying coach and mentor, develop the team, visionary. Having room for growth. I like that.
Yep.
Courage. That's a good one. Strategic orientation, wisdom. I wonder if it kind of, depends on the situation you're in and the organization you're in. There's certainly going to be different things that kind of rise to the top depending where you are as an organization and what industry you're in and what kind of competitive environment you're in, et cetera. Lots of things could rise to the top.
You're right. And all of these are correct. But the one we're going to highlight is, and this comes from an article, approximately 6 years ago, self-awareness can help leaders more than an MBA can. This was out of Harvard Business Review. And the authors make a very compelling case that the most important skill is self-awareness, because from that skill, somebody can work on all these other things that you included in the chat.
Well, and a couple of people have mentioned emotional intelligence, and self-awareness is certainly a big part of emotional intelligence.
No question, no question. And so the point in emphasizing that self-awareness is maybe the the foundation to an effective 360 is that that's what we're trying to drive. We're trying to help uncover blind spots. We're trying to help others see how they're perceived with their leadership, with the way they manage others, with the way they coach, all of that. So it is how we, in some ways, how we most effectively teach self-awareness. I'm curious, how many have had, say, more than, I'm going to just throw out a number, more than four 360 assessments in their career? I'm just kind of curious if, and that can just run in the chat, but I've had a lot, Dave's had a lot, and obviously because our organization is, we study these, we design them, and then we have software that implements them. How many of you have had a lot? And just throw that in there. Um, I always find new information from every 360 I participate in. There's always a new insight, and sometimes it just confirms or reaffirms areas that are a weakness possibly, and sometimes my strengths uh, in um, uh, in what I need to work on. Dave, you bring up a lot that sometimes we shouldn't be looking for weaknesses on a 360. What should we be looking for instead?
So, I mean, I think there's a few different schools of thought in terms of what you look for. I think there have been times when I have been very strengths based in terms of like, let's look for strengths and let's look at building on the strengths, especially since most of the 360s where I coach other individuals, I'm coaching them in a development capacity. One of the things that I really like to have focused on in the last, I'll call it 5 years probably, is yes, we want to understand strengths, and yes, we do want to understand, are there any blind spots or any major issues that someone's encountering, but we also want to find out what is most important to this person, and we can find that out a little bit by just kind of or if you're taking your own 360, asking yourself, what are the things that I'm trying to accomplish over the next 6 months to a year? What are my key priorities? What are the things that what's the direction I'm trying to take the business, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can look at your 360 through that lens and say, okay, this isn't my lowest score, it's not my highest score, but it's the most important competency that I need to develop over the next little while in order for me to be successful.
That's right, Dave. That's tip number one from our webinar, is rather than using a rubric of looking for gaps or high scores or low scores, ask if you're coaching one of these, ask a participant, hey, what do you need to accomplish? And then look for the feedback that's most directly correlated to success with those future goals. It's a different way of approaching and helping them process the feedback they've been given. This happened to me. I had the opportunity to participate in a 360 program from the Center of Creative Leadership, CCL, nonprofit, and I learned a lot about how to think more systemically and how to think about processes. And it was something I had never thought about or considered, but I realized it was vital if I were going to succeed in the coming years, is developing that competency.
Yeah, I like one of the comments in the chat, which is exactly what a very good philosophy, which was mitigate the development areas. This is Miriam. Just went on the screen. Thank you. Mitigate the development areas, but build the strengths instead of turning weaknesses into strengths. And the reason why I like that is that it is very hard to take a weakness, take the thing that you have struggled with your entire life, maybe even since elementary school and high school, and say, this is the thing I'm going to make into a strength. It's much easier to take that thing that you're struggling with and say, I'm going to make this so it's no longer a negative distraction. I mitigate it. I can bring it up to a level of competency, so where I'm not not terrible at it, but it's probably never going to be an area of strength. And so, focusing on just the areas where I score the lowest or where I'm weakest is sometimes a trap when we're looking at 360s.
Yeah, well said, and thank you, Miriam. That's wonderful advice, and a really great way to be an effective 360 coach is helping mitigate those development areas. Okay, let's jump to our next question. This is obvious, but I want to confirm what we're doing. When we use a 360, what are we actually measuring? This is a survey science question. What are we actually measuring when we send out a 360-degree assessment? I'm curious what people's thoughts are. This is so. As you think about that, we're not measuring. I'll give you some hints. We are measuring perception. We're not measuring a person's sentiment necessarily, which is very common in employee surveys, right? In employee surveys, we ask people to tell us about how they feel about an organization or their attitudes towards the organization or even their beliefs. Do you have confidence that the organization has a successful future? In a 360, what we're asking is for the frequency of a behavior. There is an evaluative component. I'm not denying that, but it's centered around looking at someone else and asking, do I see that behavior, right? Do they break down large tasks into manageable subtasks? That's a behavior. So it's just a little bit of a different approach in how we think about the survey itself. We're asking for frequency of behavior and behavior patterns.
So there's some really good responses in the chat, Matt, that maybe I can say. A lot of you mentioned perception, and that is true. We are measuring people's perceptions at a point of time. What is it? What perceptions are we measuring? There's a few comments in here that mention effectiveness as a leader. Agreed. Others that mention competencies, and still others that would say, and this is Christian's comment. In fact, maybe I'll put it up here. Apart from the organizational relevant competencies, we would look for actual behaviors is being demonstrated in the day-to-day work.
Yep.
I think that pretty much pinpoints it, because we do measure competencies in these 360s, and by competency, what we mean is of course perceived, like others' perceptions of how we demonstrate that competency. But how do we demonstrate a competency? Is through behaviors, observable behaviors, and that's what we're measuring.
And that's why I like to pair 360s with other types of surveys, because it's a different measurement instrument. We're not just measuring how someone feels about their leader. We're trying to say, do you see that leader engaging in certain behaviors that are correlated to success?
We run engagement surveys here a lot, organizational surveys, lots of different sorts of organizational surveys, and often we will ask how people feel about their manager. And the scores that come in on engagement surveys about managers are usually very high. They're, in fact, one of the highest scoring sections is the My Manager section in our organizational surveys that we run. And that's because, generally speaking, for the most part, people will just kind of like in an organizational survey, give their manager the benefit of the doubt. They're focused more on giving feedback back to the organization, not necessarily trying to improve the behaviors or competencies of their manager through the organizational survey. So a 360 gives us the opportunity to say, we're not giving feedback to the organization and giving managers feedback as part of that. We're now giving feedback directly to the manager, and we're getting really specific about how I've seen that manager manage, how I've seen them lead, how I've seen them provide feedback, all these things that are very granular. That's what we're doing in a 360.
Okay, so we're going to pivot now, and we're going to talk about a class of 360 that are really highly effective, and they relate to this sentiment. I didn't go to business school, so how can I become a better leader? Okay. We have found that 360s in this type of use case are pretty effective. So, what are they? Well, physicians, lawyers, architects, classical engineers, meaning structural engineers or civil engineers, and then uh, project managers, construct. These are all folks that really, in their education, they studied their craft really well, but they probably didn't encounter anything on leadership, on good management practices, anything along those lines. And so they are smart people. They're capable of taking feedback and using that to tweak their um, their behavior. I'm going to give an example, and then Dave can maybe think of another one. But we see this a lot with physician leaders. These are physicians that are very talented. They've been, seeing patients, and they become leaders in a large hospital system. Now they're managing people. They're interacting with administrators. They're interacting with uh, uh, charge nurses. They're all of this, and so it's very effective. And sometimes they're not great. They're used to being in charge. They may not have a great bedside manner when it comes to leading others. You can give them a 360, and their adoption of the feedback is greater sometimes than a rank and file business graduate, a business school graduate. Dave, can you think of any other examples?
Yeah, I would throw out, and I think someone mentioned this already in the chat, but software engineers. Some of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life are software engineers. People that can, and some of the most visionary people too, are software engineers. And yet, in all the work that they've done, and some of it was formal education, but a lot of it was, school of hard knocks of learning how to develop software. They really don't get exposure to that. And I do see software engineers. They when we sit down with people that are kind of leaders, have been elevated to leadership status in a software development team. They take 360 feedback very seriously, and they really want to improve it. In fact, they're the ones that really pick apart the numbers a lot as we talk to them and work with them through the feedback.
Yeah, I will tell you right off the bat, if you run 360s in a group of engineers, be prepared that your scores are going to follow the curve exactly. Average means average. But these, what we're saying is a lot of times we make these available, and those that are familiar with them maybe have some business training. They gravitate and they might grab them. We have to, as leaders and those in charge of talent, help guide some of these folks to you to say, hey, this is a good choice for you. You really will find this to be a good experience. It doesn't have to be viewed as a negative. This is a real chance for you to get some important feedback and then think about how you can improve your leadership. So
Matt,
we need to do a better job helping these folks select in to the process.
let me share a comment here from Barbara. We use 360 for all staff, enables people to perform better in a team as well as manage their contributions to the workplace better. And I think that's a really good way to do it. Is that we don't just have to wait until people are in a leadership position. If we start 360s as their individual contributors, software engineer teams are a great place to do. The physician teams are a great place to do 360s to see how are we working together, how are we collaborating together as individual contributors.
Yeah, construction professionals, these are folks that work on large, vertical projects. They are very talented, very bright, often leading teams of hundreds of people, if not thousands, and have had relatively little experience in this area. So another use case. So tip number 2, as we talked about here, is make sure as you think about how you deploy these in your organizations that you might give special attention to these types of leaders, these types of professionals. Okay, we're going to jump to some standard use cases now. And so the next couple slides are 6 standard use cases that you might see in any type of organization. And we're just going to cover those just so that we get them out and process them, and then we're going to turn to some more unique use cases. So I just saw Andres this question. What about a company with 30 employees? You can stage them. You can run just two at a time. Uh, you can run everybody through it, and then have joint coaching sessions for everybody. We do that where we'll hold a webinar where we for all 30 people, and kind of teach them how to interpret their results, and they can go through it together. Now the key is you don't give everyone the same instrument. You need to think about instruments, and we'll talk about this later, instruments that are designed for those that are new to the workforce or new to the organization, and then instruments for those that might have several years of experience under their belt.
And different instruments for those who are leaders versus individual contributors, et cetera.
Yeah. So getting back to developing senior leaders. So this is probably the most common 360-degree feedback scenario. And why I think it's particularly important is there comes a point where senior leaders are often open to feedback, but those directly under them are fearful of giving feedback to a senior leader. As you rise up the ranks of the organization, there's a tendency you don't want to displease the boss. So we stop giving feedback. My sense is that, and in many cases, the executive wants to receive the feedback. So having a structured way to do it with some confidentiality thresholds is a great way to kind of get past that hurdle, that natural hurdle, where someone may be reluctant to give feedback to a senior leader. The next one is team building. And this is sort of what we were talking about maybe with a smaller company where everybody has the opportunity to participate in the 360s together, and it's kind of a shared experience. This is a great way for people to sort of coach each other. We just recently did an exercise in our organization, and I was paired up with one of our customer success managers, and we had a really great conversation about her 360, and it was really delightful just to be integrated in a way that wasn't based on a hierarchy. She just happened to sit by me during this process, and we were able to talk about her 360s, and she was able to see how I was thinking about the feedback I had been given, and I was able to sort of help her process her feedback, having coached lots of executives on 360s. So it's a good way to build teams. It just has to be structured the right way, and it has to be viewed as an opportunity to get feedback. Dave, jump in if you see any comments that we are.
Yeah, let me share a comment real quick.
Yeah.
It's a question. We are a small not-for-profit with a working board. Time and resources are at minimum. So how do you manage the 360 review with everything else we do with minimal time? Do you think 360 is worth doing for a small organization? That's a question from Susan. I would say yes, it is worth doing. One of the things you want to think about is if time and resources are limited, then you might want to think about limiting the amount of time you spend in the actual administration of the 360 process, because that can become a long and drawn out thing if you are constantly having to mess with the tools that you're using in order to do a 360. That's why, when DecisionWise has developed its tools, we try to make administration as easy as possible. But even within a really good tool like we have, you would want to figure out, how am I going to do, if I have an organization of 30 employees, how do I do it so that it's of minimal impact to all of us? Well, you might want to think about doing all 30 employees, together, so that it's only one administration process, or just doing it in cohorts of 2 different groups. And then when it comes to providing the feedback back, providing the reports back, you can kind of take advantage of the fact that you're in cohorts and provide the reports to everybody together, and then walk them through the reports and walk them through how they should be interpreting the reports in a group setting. And so that we're not it takes like an hour or something like that to walk everybody through the reports and what they should be kind of interpreting from those reports, what they should be learning, et cetera. So there are ways for us to really minimize the work impact of doing a 360 and still get all the benefits or most of the benefits from doing a 360.
I wanted to highlight one from Andrew, Dave. This was I coach a company where they do so many 360s that executives have stopped paying attention to their own results. So what are your thoughts on that, where it feels like, oh, it's just noise because we do it so often?
Yeah, and I don't like, I personally don't think that a 360 is necessary more than, let's say, once a year. And I don't know if that's your cadence or if you have a more rapid cadence than that, Andrew. But usually what I'd say is we would try, the organizations that we work with that kind of have ongoing programs, we'll target leaders or people in the organization once per year on a development 360. They might also do 360 evaluation as part of their performance review. But once a year from a development perspective is probably enough. If you wanted to do once a year and then a follow-up 360 to kind of see how am I doing, you could also do something like that. But if you're doing it any more than that, it probably will become background noise for some of those leaders. The other thing that I would say is, like, with development 360s, the investment you get from the people that are going through it really depends on their willingness or their desire to invest in their own growth and their own learning. If you switch to using a performance 360, where it's part of the performance evaluation, part of the actual appraisal of their performance, then they tend to take it a little more seriously because it's measuring part of their performance. And so you may be at a point in maturity in your organization where you need to use 360 at a more with a little more teeth to it and make it part of their appraisal.
So I agree that the cadence. I think absolutely the maximum is once a year. I actually favor a 2-year cycle. It's just there's art. This is not a science to this. So these are But I'm just to offer a different perspective. I think 2 years is an effective cycle for people. It just depends, and it also depends on when they enter the organization, how long they've been there. It's difficult to run a 360 for someone who's been in an organization for less than a year. Sometimes do they have enough interactions with others? So you have to think about all of those things as you do it. Sometimes it's good ideas to run cohorts rather than running everybody through it. Maybe you have off-year cycles and things like that. So those are ways to think about it. Enhancing L&D programs. What we mean by this is, if you run your 360, you can get it in group data like in our system, and this allows you to inform where you want to put your training, because you can actually see areas that maybe need a little attention or where people would benefit from something. So you can use 360-degree feedback data, consolidated data, in order to inform your L&D programs.
And it's important to note, when we're talking about team building or we're talking about L&D programs, it's still individuals getting their 360-degree feedback data. It's just that we're able to aggregate 360-degree feedback in an anonymized form. So we put all of that together and we say, okay, how are our leaders doing on communication? How are they doing on change management? And see them in aggregate together. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about group reporting. There was a question if 360 is the right tool for a group. Yes, it's a great tool for a group. You put a group through it. And then each person gets their own feedback, but then you can also put that all together and say, okay, how is this group doing overall in this area, that area, et cetera?
Yeah. Okay, so some standard use cases. Let's go to the next 3. Supporting low performers. Now, I like this idea, but only if it's intentional and done with a certain degree of with the right attitude, let's say. Okay, so if you've got 3, for example, your employee engagement survey helps you identify a few leaders that might need some support, maybe score or reveal something about that particular leader. What we don't want to do is just say, oh, you're automatically assigned a 360 and good luck and get better, right? That's not the approach we want to take. This is where coaching coupled with the 360 is really helpful, where the where the participant can really think about their goals and how the feedback's going to impact their ability to meet their KPIs. Um, so we do want to use these as a way to help, I think, give more clarity to those that might have lower scores. What is it like immediately around you? A 360 is a good way to kind of measure the micro employee experience right at the team level. And so I think it's a good tool. Dave, do you have any concerns or thoughts as it
Yeah,
relates to
yeah. I
performance?
think what you don't want is to give 360 in your organization a brand of you get this because you're in trouble. Any way you can avoid that, I think, is really good. And so, as I've worked with organizations in implementing something like this, it's often you don't just do low performers. You do, you may tap low performers, but you make it voluntary for others as well, so that you can. It doesn't just have to be like a scarlet letter that's placed on a leader because they've gone through a 360. So I like to make sure that we're using it for a variety of reasons, not just for supporting low performers, but it's definitely a use case that we see often.
Okay. There was Andrew talked about performance 360s. We'll come to that maybe at the end, Andrew, a little bit, and talk about how we think about, because what you measure and the style of your questions are just a bit different. So we'll cover that as we kind of wrap things up. Um,
And I want to make clear when we talk about development 360s, they are pretty comprehensive assessments. So Mariam mentions that they do it every 2 weeks after they've completed a development sprint, and so which might be more categorized as peer reviews, like they do in healthcare with nurses and things like that. So it may be a little bit different. What we're talking about is a breakdown of 13 or 14 different competencies, up to 40 or 50 60 different behaviors and things like that. So it's a long form development 360 is what we're talking about. If you're doing smaller peer-to-peer feedback in between, that can be very frequent.
yep. Investing in high potentials. This is a great way to signal to those that they may be on a short list in an appropriate way. It may be a good way to figure out among a group of 10 people who might you want to focus on or invest in. We just did for a healthcare system in Texas. We were asked to come in. We ran approximately 2360s across senior leaders, and then we're able to create some group reports and give those to the CEO, who was able then to kind of get a feel for who might be next in line to replace the CEO in the coming years. And so a great way to suss out information about those who might be strong candidates. Developing new leaders. Okay, so we know that often leaders are promoted not because they show a lot of leadership skills necessarily, but because they're super performers or super doers. And so they're like that first group. They may need some feedback to help get them started on the right foot. And so when we promote, making sure there's enough time for their direct reports to get a feel for their leadership style, it's a really good idea to have a cadence already set up, say 1 year after promotion, where they're able to have a 360 and to sit down with a coach for a 90-minute session and really absorb the feedback and think about how they can use it to improve on a go-forward basis. So an excellent way to develop young leaders or new leaders in an organization. All right, let's go to some mature organization use cases. So these are, maybe you're really good at 360s. And what I mean by mature organization isn't size, but basically maybe you're pretty good at employee listening, you're pretty good at employee experience stuff. And so just some additional use cases. Follow up to the engagement survey. We talked a little bit about this with some low performers, but I actually think this applies to if your employee engagement survey surfaces people that are vital in your org network even either your formal or informal organizational networks. It's a great way to look at why someone is successful and to try to use it as a way to understand what they're doing well. It's great, as we mentioned, for some who maybe need a little extra feedback in order to take the next step. And sometimes it's okay because you need to confirm what the information is in the engagement survey. Maybe you just need to confirm that this individual needs a different place in the organization or needs a different opportunity. So number 7 is a follow-up to an engagement survey. Number 8, I don't know how many, I'm curious, I'm going to ask this in the chat. How many of you have a formal competency plan or a formal set of competencies that you've designed and thought about that match your organization? A lot of organizations go through the competency design process, and they think specifically about what's needed at particular levels.
Yeah, and many of them will start with company values. They'll also look at what is our strategy and what are the competencies we need to execute on that strategy. And they'll also say, what's the culture that we're trying to drive in order to execute on the strategy that we have.
Mm-hmm. So you can send a message about the type of leaders you want based on what you measure. If you want to drive a particular type of value or culture, measure it and make it important and put it front and center in your process, and people will react to that. They will get that implicit message loud and clear. Succession planning. I just gave a use case earlier about our work with a healthcare system in Texas, but this is I see this. We had a large client that had several hundreds of car dealerships, automotive dealerships across the country, and they use this as a way to help grow dealer managers, those that were in charge of the dealership. So they used it as part of what they considered their university, their internal learning system. Self-driven development. So how many of you make access to 360 available upon request, or do you have a way for someone to ask for 360-degree feedback? And you don't have to have a lot of technology to do this. It can just be teaching HR business partners to let leaders know that it's an option, and that they're happy to support them in that process, and that's their role, is to support them and then let them get their data and move on. Reinforcing strategy, number 11. Again, what you measure signals areas that are important to the organization. So that's why we don't.
One of the reasons why I like reinforcing strategy is one of these is because I think depending on what we're measuring in a 360, it may be that leaders dismiss it just because they're like, well, this doesn't feel very relevant to me. And so when we are putting together a 360, and we try to do this with our standard assessments at DecisionWise generally, but when we're putting together a 360 that's specific to our organization, that's going to be used broadly within the organization, we really want to think about what are the competencies and behaviors that will drive success in this organization. And part of it is success with working with people and leading people and things like that. But part of it is success in our industry, success in competing with the other players out there, and making sure that we have the behaviors and competencies built up in this organization in order to do that. If you present that sort of a 360 to leaders, they're more likely to take it very seriously because they're looking at things that are credibly related to their success and to the organization's success.
That's the danger of off-the-shelf assessments, is they become just a thing that happens to you rather than the organization partnering with leaders to gather feedback and to think about what's important. Sometimes less is more, and we'll talk about that again as a trend. We need to be thoughtful in how we design these instruments. Number 12, something I'm familiar with just today. I just sent a board leader a 360 report for a nonprofit in Southern California, a really large nonprofit in Southern California. And this is how their executive director is evaluated by the board, and they love the process.
Mhm.
And we're very upfront. They know that the board receives the feedback. They know I coach the executive director, and I also have a session where I visit with the board. But the board loves it for the reasons they're kind of on the slide. It's a great way for the board to see what the staff thinks of the executive director, and also then to give their feedback. And it's a really effective process when it comes to boards wanting to get feedback or give feedback to a C-suite or to an important senior leadership team. And it accommodates because it allows for asynchronous communication. You just don't have to all get into a meeting together. It can be sent out and processed through software pretty easily. So I really, really like using 360s with boards of directors and making them the kind of the featured rater group in a 360. Okay, now one size does not fit all, so we're gonna turn to some cautions and to some suggestions on how we think about. And we just mentioned already, off the shelf instruments are easy to adopt, but they can send the wrong message. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this as I've outlined in the slides, and then we'll get there. So the first trend is flip the script. So one of the things I'm seeing is the questions are framed from the perspective of the person giving the feedback. And so the question might be, this person gives me the direction I need to do my job well, rather than saying, this person provides adequate direction. It's very personalized. This would be very effective in a 180, where it's like, oh, we've actually framed the questions from the perspective of what the individual needs from that leader. Reframing it is a good way to reset the process and maybe kind of make it less stale if you've been doing it for a while. And it's also can help the leader understand the reason. It's not, it's less evaluative, and they're like, oh, that person needs this from me. And I can sense how much I'm giving that person what they need. You know, is it a lot or a little? So if it's very little, if the answer is very little to this person gives me the direction I need to do my job well, that just might be received differently. And I know it sounds kind of like we're just changing things around for the sake of changing things around, but when it comes to feedback and the way perceptions work, this might be a good idea. And this goes, the second bullet point is the 360 about the organization or about the feedback the employee needs? If your perspective is we do this to employees and we have a standard process and all of that, what might get lost is the value of the 360 itself, which is the feedback, which is having a safe way and a way that's kind of structured for someone to understand what is the experience I'm creating for others. And so I think a lot of times the tendency is for us to become so process oriented that maybe we frame things and make invitations to others. We maybe make that all about the org and all about HR and all about our own needs, rather than thinking about the needs of the person receiving the feedback. Know your audience. Is the instrument focused on tactical proficiency, or is it more about a leader's ability to connect with and guide people? So is it do the competencies focus on strategic thinking or tactical proficiency? Does the instrument focus on ability to lead people, or does it focus on the ability to follow process?
It's interesting because I've been in the design process with a lot of different groups on this. I was working with the design process on designing an assessment for a sales organization within a large pharmaceutical company, and they were really focused on in the 360 the sales leaders' results, and not so much on their behaviors. And so they were trying to ask questions like, does this person achieve results? That sort of thing, and granular within that category. There's lots of ways that you can check on salespeople's results that don't come in a 360. There's lots of ways that you can test tactical proficiency that you don't need a 360 in order to do it. If somebody's building widgets, you can see how efficiently they're building widgets, how the level of quality can be measured through objective forms of measurement. And so what we're really, big opportunity on the 360 is to apply as objective as we can measurements to subjective behaviors in this setting. So we're really looking for some of the soft skills that we have a really hard time measuring in any other form.
Yeah. There was a question about statistical validity, and that's always a challenge when it comes to 360s in some respect. With statistical validity, we're trying to understand, does the question measure the right construct? Does it measure the right idea that we're trying to talk about? Are the questions related, for example, to decision making? And then does it consistently hit the bullseye where it's intended? So is it consistently kind of hitting the mark for everybody? And when you think about 360-degree feedback, while it's true we want some statistical validity, we also want avenues inside just for people to get feedback from others. And feedback's messy, and feedback doesn't always follow statistical validity. So we have certainly questions that we have done that to, and they are in our bank of questions. Dave, you know this well, but I don't think we should avoid having the opportunity to gather a meaningful feedback just because we won't know whether it's statistically valid.
Well, and the way you avoid kind of messy situations is try to be as clear as possible and as clear as language as possible. We don't double barrel items. We go straight to a construct or a behavior that we're trying to measure and describe it the best way we possibly can in the simplest terms that we possibly can in order to get that measurement. The problem is you can send the same this person communicates question to different audiences and get wildly different scores. If they manage up, the manager might think this person's a great communicator, and direct reports might think I never hear from this person. And so we get wildly different responses depending on who's answering the question. Statistical validity is something that is taken very seriously within psychometric assessments. Someone earlier mentioned the use of something like Myers-Briggs. And those are the things that those psychometric assessments are meant to try to give you feedback on who you are as a person, your inborn preferences that have been there your entire life and will be there your entire life. And in this case, we are trying to measure observable behaviors, and someone's behavior can change overnight. It's not something that necessarily is tied to them for the rest of their lives. And so we try in the interest of making the 360 as useful as possible. And as Matt mentioned, we have many competencies and things that have been through the ringer of statistical validity. But if we don't have anything in our library that matches that, we would not shy away from creating a new item in order to get the most useful piece of feedback that we possibly can get.
Yeah, and that's why coaching is good to pair with that, because coaching can bring that to light, make sure the participant knows how to evaluate the feedback they're given. There was a question too about pairing emotional intelligence assessments with 360s. That's a good idea. We tend to have a derailleur section in our 360s. And that is in our view, kind of how we measure emotional intelligence. We're also working on a specific 360 about emotional intelligence. So those are some options to think about there.
If you build your competencies around typical emotional intelligence models, you can kind of get a really good sense of a leader's emotional intelligence just simply by getting the feedback around those models. So if you have a model that you like Goleman's model or something like that for emotional intelligence, we can build a 360 around some of the constructs in that model.
Lastly, Andres had talked about coupling a personality test with the 360. We love doing that. We're not going to talk about which ones we prefer. One of the nice things about a personality test, when debriefed by a coach, is they can say, see how that personality preference is manifested in the feedback you've been given. you can actually make that link. But you need to have someone that's trained in the personality assessment to do that. And so you have to. That's why it's really, I think, needs to be done as a coaching effort, and not necessarily just dropping 2 reports on somebody's desk.
Right.
Okay. More is less. Sometimes it's okay if you want to focus on just 3 competencies, but go a little deeper. What I mean by that is sometimes you don't have to. It is a good idea to have 12 or 14, but sometimes if you really are saying, "Look, I want to help you get better at communication," then you would think about maybe 4 or 5 competencies: interpersonal communication, ability to communicate result, and you keep it simple, but it's focused on a specific area. You don't have to overwhelm people and just say, "Oh, you've got to be good at this and you've got to be good at this." They say, "No, let's frame this down to something that you want to work on." And so if you're an HR business partner and they say, "Hey, I want to get some feedback," you could follow up and say, "In what areas?" And then maybe the instrument is tailored to that.
And even if you're running an assessment, as is most typical, with 13 or 14 different competencies on them, even then, the guidance that you provide to people receiving the reports, either through coaching or through some other method, should say, hey, choose 2 or 3 of these things to really do a deep dive on, instead of trying to improve all of them.
Yeah. And finally, Pulse 360s. I do not think as we mentioned, there's certainly survey fatigue happening, and so we don't necessarily want to just do a 360 or 360. So one way is to think about pulses, which is maybe just 3 or 4 simple questions or a super question that's kind of like, "Hey, this person's improved." Another idea that we really like is once the person's thought about what they want to work on, they we actually, it says, "Hey, I've decided to work on the areas of delegation and decision making," and all the question is have I improved, stayed the same, or gotten worse? And it might be 3 questions is all. It's a true pulse, right? And it's a true pulse to to a group that participated in the 360 process as raters. To those that were invited as raters, we might just pulse them and say, "Hey, how's this person doing?" And it's kind of a thumbs up, sideways thumb, no change, or trending in the wrong direction. Okay, so that's something to think about. Is we don't always just have to do 360 after 360. We can be thoughtful in how we pulse.
And Matt, since I think they saw the more is less point, let's answer this question really quickly. For a decent 360 instrument, how many statements, questions should we construct for more effectiveness? So in our typical 360 that we do, if it's for development and if it's comprehensive, not that we're just trying to dive down on 1 or 2 different competencies. If it's for development, if it's comprehensive, it's somewhere between 10 and 14 competencies, and each competency is measured by 3 or 4 behavioral statements that define the competency. So it's somewhere between 40 and maybe 60 items on an assessment. You may leave some extra room in there for derailer statements that are like negatively framed, but trying to check to make sure that there's not any kind of major issues in there. But somewhere between 40 or 60 statements is pretty typical. If you get a lot beyond that, we've used instruments from other organizations, from other consulting organizations in our organization that were 120 items, and they just get very overbearing to complete. And so you just kind of get tired of those things. So 40 to 60, that'll take somebody somewhere between 10 or 15 minutes to complete on average. To answer another person's question, how long does it take to take the assessment? 10 or 15 minutes usually, if you can keep it between 40 and 60 statements.
The pulses, because we use our system, generates pulse reports. They're not a standard report. They're just available. The responses come by group report. It's a little different in reporting. So I wanted to just touch upon performance versus development. In development 360s, we're helping people assess how they engage in the workforce, how they present themselves. It's a lot about the how. In performance, we're talking about the what. Is your work product comply with what we want? Do you do the things you're asked to do? Do you do it to a level of quality that's expected? So performance questions have to be thought about differently. They have to be framed differently, and they are measuring a different perspective. And so we do not ever recommend just taking 360 questions and grouping them together and calling it a performance. You need to have performance style questions for a performance review that's conducted by 360. And our performance review is a hybrid. It still has narrative components, it still has an overall manager score, and it has 360-degree feedback. We're trying to take the more suited, or the three most common ways that performance reviews are done, and we're marrying them together rather than just taking a 360 and saying this acts as a type of performance review.
And
Dave?
to that point, Matt, different questions are presented to a person's manager and to the individual than they are to peers. And so the peer section, because we roll this out to an entire organization, and the peer review section is actually pretty limited in terms of what we're asking them to complete. It might be as many as, it could be as few as 10, but up to maybe 20 questions that we're asking of peers, because those peers are going to have to fill them out for a bunch of people laterally. And we don't just go to all peers and all direct reports. We might do a selection of them. So it's a little different in terms of process.
Yeah, so process is different. The nature of the question, what we're trying to measure, is different. And the technique, and it's a different thing. And we're going to do a webinar coming up on how to use 360-degree style feedback in performance reviews. But you can't take one and just substitute it for the other. There was one question, just a technical question Dave, I'm gonna throw this to you. It's on the rating scale, 4, 5, or 7.
Yeah. So I could probably do like an hour on this and have people argue with me for an hour too. We use a 7-point scale. And the reason why we use a 7-point scale is it's hard to defeat human nature in the way that they look at these scales. Nobody wants to go typically below the middle response. And so I don't know, maybe 10% of all of our responses go on a 7-point scale, go below 4. Nobody wants to go below 4. And so really what that turns it into is almost the equivalent of a 4-point scale. 4, 5, 6, or 7 is what they'll mark. And so we like to have a little more diversity in our responses. Like if we go to a 5-point scale, now it's like people mark 3, 4, or 5. And now we've got just a little bit of play there. But if we go to a 7-point scale, now they'll mark 4, 5, 6, or 7. Might even be true. We've never done it, but like with a 9-point scale, it could be a little bit bigger. But really what we're trying to do is make sure that we get enough diversity of responses in order for us to have a solid understanding of where we stand compared to other people, so that we don't have the grouping that we would typically have with a smaller scale than 7.
Right. Okay. Just jumping ahead, this is just this is something where you can get something in your program for no cost, which is, why don't we frame things as, would you like to request additional feedback from your team? Meaning, don't say, do you want a 360? Frame it around what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people get feedback. And feedback is positive. I heard a story the other day about Nick Saban, famous college football coach and NFL coach, very successful at Alabama. He's become a broadcaster. And those working with him in the broadcasting world said they're shocked by how often he calls them up and asks for feedback. How often he's pestering them, where could I get better? That's film study in the NFL, right? And in our world, feedback is a type of film study for a leader or a manager. Okay, I want to get to this last thing. I want to crowdsource what we've learned from this. So I don't want to tell you what the key takeaway it is, but I would love for each of you to be willing to put in an idea, a thought, something that struck you into the chat, because you're going to help coach each other and guide each other. So if you guys is a phrase we say here in Utah, and I'm trying not to say it, it's dumb. If each of you would be willing to put into the chat your key takeaway, I think we could really learn from each other. Yeah, the slides are available, and you can and I'll let our team put into the chat how they can get the slides.
The recording is also available as well. So
yeah, and you can watch the recording again. Will also be available. But
if you need to get to sleep tonight, you can just put it on your headphone. Yeah. Well, good way for that.
Yeah. So I'm curious if anybody's willing to go out on a limb and say, hey, what is something you took away from today's webinar that you'd like to share so others can benefit from it? I'm getting nervous, Dave. Like maybe we didn't teach anything new.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
Christian.
you. Thank you.
Reinforce the importance of behavioral insights in 360 and micro tips and overall perspective. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, Stephanie says they want to share some of the use cases with HR partners to help them get creative on when to request. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions today. Barbara mentions performance appraisals. A lot of questions on performance appraisals. It looks like we're going to need to do a webinar on performance appraisals and invite everybody back just so we can give you some more information on that and how we best run that. We can even show you the structure of how we put it together. I think it's becoming a more common trend to use 360s in performance appraisal, or at least that component in performance appraisal. So we can talk through that in the future. Hopefully we gave you some good information today.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. We're at our time. We really appreciate your support, and we hope this is useful. We're going to continue these in the future. We'll get performance on the docket. Thanks, everybody.